Josh, you just tell me next slide and I do it next.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Right, off we go then. Hi everyone. So this is a talk by me. Hi, I'm Josh. On science, spirituality and psychedelics. And also got a little subtitle there, Reconnecting with Mother Nature in the Age of the Machine. So let's just dive right in, shall we? Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll start off by, so I should probably give a bit of a preface about where I'm coming at this from. So I studied physics and philosophy for my undergrad, and then I did a master's in international relations, but I've always been fascinated by the kind of intersection of these topics, and psychedelics has always seemed a kind of natural middle ground for me. And here we've got the kind of famous stoned ape image, and yeah, so there's this kind of, at the moment within society, we're kind of living in this kind of interesting period in history where there's been a decline in religious belief for the past at least 200 years, especially it seems to be correlated with the rise of industrial society. And you have the formation of the kind of Darwinian timescale and kind of naturalist paradigm in the 18th century, which these kind of methodologies, in order to come up with these stories about the origin of humanity and the origin of the universe, they require technology. You know, we require instruments that we use to measure processes repeatedly, and that's how modern science has come to the ages that they now do. Instead, by contrast, ancient mythologies, we know that instead they tended to see the world in a much more animistic kind of fashion, where they regarded deities as being something which were not only real but imminently involved in human affairs. And we've had a bit of discussion from Ben about you know, this kind of concept that, you know, through psychedelic rituals one can commune with the gods and, you know, see them, so to speak. But of course, you know, modern science tends to view these kind of experiences with skepticism, but also the tales are in these ancient mythologies of, you know, giants and human-animal hybrids. They're regarded as kind of fairy tales. Some people try and extract the symbolic meaning from these stories and, you know, analyze the psychological meaning, you know, associating dragons with chaos or, you know, whatever it be. But I will be discussing throughout the rest of this talk this kind of interface between what is real and what's imaginary, and how my journey into theoretical physics has kind of pushed the boundary of what I think is real and what's imaginary, and how I see those two kind of concepts. And I'll discuss a little bit more about the stoned ape hypothesis and you know, what the significance is of the recent discovery in the 20th century that psychedelic chemicals are also produced by our body as well as naturally in the world. Next slide, please. So yeah, so there's this kind of narrative at the moment where science and religion are regarded as kind of two different conceptual realms of inquiry, and I would personally say that this not only doesn't have to be the case, but it also wasn't always. And yeah, I mean, okay, so, well, I should probably just discuss this picture here with the lovely Mr. McKenna, but, you know, he's talking about, you know, the way in which science kind of approaches these mind-altering chemicals. It's like, he says, you know, people say it's a reduction of the psychedelic experience because it's caused by drugs. It's like, okay, you've met God, but you just took this drug, right? And it's like, well, okay, is that really, you know, that simple? Or actually, how do, like, drugs exist in the first place? And why do they exist? Like, and how do atoms even exist? And what are they? Because especially in the context of psychedelics, something that people often report is experiencing higher dimensions or alternative dimensions, which kind of seem to break the human mind in these kind of hypergeometric patterns and realms. And so, you know, there's a kind of classic atom of the model of the atom at the moment that we have, which is kind of 3D, like the solar system. But there are alternative models of, the way we see atoms themselves, and one would be this depiction here of this kind of wormhole network where you regard the proton as being a singularity point, and then the electron and also positrons as the two ends of the wormhole. And I'll discuss a little bit more about positrons and antimatter in a moment. But I'll just say quickly that the discovery of quantum mechanics as well has certainly unleashed a new kind of wave of New Age religions that have combined these kind of discoveries of modern science with these kind of ancient principles. And there's definitely this movement within the psychedelic community to try and reconcile our kind of two main paradigms and stories about the world. Next slide, please.
Can I just check? The mechanic quote is the last line.
Yes, I believe so, yes. I should have read that out. Thank you so much, John. He says, matter is not lacking in magic, matter is magic. And that's the kind of, thank you so much, John, because that is the kind of perspective that I try to take on these things. And I mean, as a physicist, primarily, I'm more interested, people make all these arguments about like, the conditions for life, can life form on other planets? And it's like, yes, of course, the Earth is not the only habitable planet. And, even when you get to the level of the multiverse, maybe this isn't even the only inhabited universe, but still there are these fundamental kind of laws that are in place in order to allow matter to form. Because if the forces of gravity and electromagnetism were different sizes, if the ratios of these forces were different, then you wouldn't be able to get anything to form at all, let alone, is this planet habitable or not? It's like, there's just nothing. That's always kind of what's fascinated me in trying to understand why, what are these constraints, what are the kind of limits of this reality, and what is the point of it all? Next slide, please. So, to discuss a little bit, okay, so you might, apologies if you just clock out now. I'm going to try and keep it like as little science as possible, but just to try and I think it's really kind of pivotal to try and understand this about time. And I mean, time, I'm sure people have had their own experiences of the relativity of time on different substances, but it's worth investigating the kind of physical basis and the logical basis of the kind of, when we have these ages of billions of years, how we derive these ages. And so, little tour of special relativity. First premise is that all reference frames are relative because they're all traveling at different speeds. But also you've got this second premise which says that the speed of light is constant in all frames. And now you might be thinking, well, hang on, that sounds a little bit contradictory because how can everything be relative? But there's this one thing which isn't. It's constant to everyone. And then it's like, well, if you really dig down into it, it was Rupert Sheldrake who really got me interested in this at first, so I recommend checking him out. But if you just say let's say the speed of light is 3 times 10 to the 8, so 3 million meters per second. Well, first you have to define what is a meter and what is a second. But how would you do that? Because what they used to do is they used to just have an object in a room in France. They'd just be like, this is a meter. And everything was measured against that. But they can't do that anymore, obviously, because it changed and that's not actually a basis of objective measurement. So what they've done now, since the 20th century, in order to get the functioning dates from radiometric dating, which is what they do to objects, to artifacts. They can do things like measure the amount of carbon-14 that's in it, different isotopes, and we know kind of roughly how long things take to decay. And so we go, well, if it's taking this long to decay now, and there's this many of the products of the decay, it must have taken this many millions of years. But that assumes that the basis of the second has remained constant for all of those years. But that itself is unverifiable because you can't ever verify what the time, if time now is flowing at the same rate as it was previously, because the past is gone already. So by its definition, science is required to kind of have this assumption of uniformity, and that nature kind of obeys these rational principles that we ourselves think we can understand, rather than it being something which is constantly in flux, and as soon as you think you've pinned it down, it's got away again. And really that's what quantum mechanics has kind of flung back into the scientific community, because that really has illustrated that when you try and pin reality down, it does something you don't expect, because you observe something and then it changes state. But when you don't observe it, it's behaving like a wave, and everything has a wavelength. Like, it, it's this kind of unintuitive game almost with reality that science seems to be playing. And yeah, but this science is often loath to admit it, but it often will acknowledge that it has gaps in its paradigm, that its story of the universe doesn't make sense. It will admit to the existence of things like dark energy and dark matter, and it will say, well, yes, but we have this time scale and this works. If we assume that the second has remained constant, then we get this time scale, and this would allow the galaxies to form in this fashion. But we have all this extra kind of dark matter and antimatter as well, but we'll just kind of not talk about that so much, and maybe we'll let the particle physicists do that, and they can work out some cool diagrams at CERN, but we won't really talk about how that impacts like reality at all, even though like what the hell is going on, like antimatter as well. Like if you go to the next slide please, Diego, we'll see that, well, one of the craziest things about antimatter, and this is what really unlocked this all for me, is that this diagram here is a very standard kind of formalism of how particles interact with each other, like really, really small particles in the atmosphere or wherever. So here you've got on the top left, you've got an electron, and then on the bottom left, you've got a positron, which is the antimatter equivalent, the antimatter opposite of the electron. And so as you can see, with time is going to the right, so the electron, which is negatively charged, is going forwards in time. But in order to have the mathematical symmetry to result in the series of results that are produced by collisions, antimatter has to travel backwards in time relative to regular matter. This symmetry is required in order to produce the experiments that we've observed. And so this is this kind of unspoken like woo-woo in physics. It's like, okay, so there's this thing which travels backwards in time around us all the time, and it's got the opposite charge of regular matter, and it's kind of invisible, but it's produced all the time around us, and we can use it in medicine. They use it in positron emission topography to scan people. They can give you a medicine that contains something which will decay to produce antimatter, and then they use that antimatter to map your body. So it's reached a level with antimatter, we've reached a level where we are able to use it, but we still haven't had a kind of societal discussion about what the hell is this stuff, and how does it interface with ancient understandings of the world. Well, I'll get onto that in a moment, but in terms of the reaction of the scientific community to this, there's still this ongoing problem with dark energy and dark matter. So dark matter, just to clarify, I should probably clarify at this point, dark matter and dark energy are regarded as separate things, because dark energy is the thing which is accelerating the universe out, because the universe isn't just expanding, it's accelerating, which means that there's energy being input into the system. And this is one of the major problems still remaining in inflationary cosmology, and there's all kinds of ad hoc solutions that modern science has to this, but basically it's like, where's the extra energy coming from? We don't know what it is. But also we have this thing called dark matter, which we know has to exist because Basically, it's about the speed at which galaxies rotate. Because if you spin an object around your head in a circle, then the part that's closest to your hand is going at a different speed to the part that's further away, because they both have to travel different distances, but in the same time, if that makes sense, because the circumference is bigger, right? So because of that, the edge of the galaxy and the center of the galaxies should spin at different rates, but they don't. And if they did, then they just spin apart into kind of chaos. But again, there's this kind of dark matter counterforce, which is hypothesized to be a halo around galaxies that's invisible, which slows down the edge so that it doesn't spin as fast, so that the galaxy doesn't rip itself apart. There's this kind of dark force which is slowing down the edge, or at least that's what people think, because the assumption with the idea that it's around the edge is that all mass has to be positive. But, and this is the crux of it all, so if you listen to nothing else but this, then that's cool. If mass can be negative, then the entire view of the universe has to change. Because, and this is crucial because antimatter, the direction in which its mass acts, has not been measured yet publicly. We know that it has the same magnitude of mass, i.e. the number is the same. So if an electron has, let's say, a mass of 1, then the positron has a mass of 1. But we don't know whether it's positive 1 or negative 1, because when we've observed antimatter, you can only observe it by trapping it in electromagnetic fields, because normally it's invisible, remember, going backwards in time all around us. The only way you can observe it is if you slow it down to stop it traveling backwards through time in magnetic fields. And then we can know it's antimatter because we know it has the opposite charge to regular matter. So that's how we know it's antimatter, because we're suspending it in an electromagnetic field. But up until now, it's been impossible to verify, at least publicly, whether yeah, we'll get onto that, but whether or not antimatter has negative mass, because the force of gravity is so much weaker than electromagnetism that if you suspend something in a magnetic field, you won't be able to tell whether it's going upwards or downwards, because any deviation from its path is most likely caused by the electromagnet itself, not by the Earth's magnetic field. So they're currently working on this at CERN. They have an experiment that's up, and we should get results sooner or later. So, in other words, I appreciate that a lot of this is going to sound like kind of unverifiable rambling, but this is one kind of key premise which will be verifiable, and will either, make this a load of nonsense, or maybe there's a little bit something deeper going on, and we should get those results. Well, who knows when we'll get them, but hopefully sometime soon. It's on the calendar. So, yeah, an increasing number of people within the physics community, even before we've received these results, they're hypothesizing that antimatter has negative mass, and that would explain how, as well, the universe is expanding outwards. Because if you think about mass as pulling everything in, antimatter is the opposite. It's pushing everything out. It's an anti-gravitational force, because if you imagine reality as like a 2D kind of sheet, this is the classic kind of illustration of the concept of a wormhole. It's like, you fold it over and then you make a hole in between. Well, if you imagine like reality like a sheet and mass is pressing down, it's like, well, is antimatter pressing up? And then that would provide this source of anti-gravitational. It's like the opposite, the inverse. And again, we've got this kind of world of opposites. And it's like, well, haven't we heard something a little bit similar about these world of opposites and this kind of dual nature of reality before? Next slide, please, Diego. So, here we go. So, this is the main kind of concept, to try and unite the two and have a kind of dialogue and resolution between the paradigm of science and the paradigm of religion and spiritualities, is to see antimatter as being what ancient peoples referred to as spirit. And this idea that they had this concept of this hidden reality which exists, and which unlocks not only one reality, but an infinite series of experiences through various methods, psychedelics not being least among those. So many of the pioneers of science themselves were keen alchemists, and the foundation of science really came out of alchemy, this kind of concept of the ability to manipulate the world and manipulate the spiritual world as well was a key part of that. And there's this kind of idea of these animal spirits which are everywhere, and you might have seen or heard about that in kind of Victorian kind of literature. It's something which kind of existed in popular consciousness until quite a recent time, this concept of the animal spirits and the role that they played in various psychiatric disorders as well. And this kind of spiritual interpretation rather than a strictly clinical, naturalistic, but in a way that's also materialist and doesn't believe there's the antimatter, that's the kind of thing, is it's only focused on the matter and the material, not the immaterial, the anti-material, so to speak. And I would contend, to put this simply, this is the kind of panpsychist, panentheist worldview, which psychedelics generally tend to go hand in hand with, at least in the sense of the cultures that we knew or we hypothesize were engaging in ritualistic use of psychedelics and their beliefs. I mean, the ancient Greeks, sure. I mean, Plato himself probably participated in the Eleusinian Mysteries, unknown, but he talks about it at least. And he's often regarded as the kind of, one of the foundations of Western philosophy. So there has been this kind of awareness of it throughout, but it seems to be something which has really been lost in the last couple hundred years. And I'd say that it's similar to the process of the way in which light pollution happens and we can't see the stars anymore. I think in a similar way, we've been disconnected from Mother Nature. And I say Mother Nature specifically because I think there's a key crucial element there of associating femininity as well with the spiritual realm and this kind of concept of concealment. I'll discuss that a little bit more in a second. But just to say, in this kind of, people, to kind of give it a tagline of how I see God, because that's some question people might ask you, or they definitely ask me. I personally, don't see God. He's not a man in a cloud in the sky. I'd see God as more like a field, and this is the kind of concept of the panpsychist worldview. It's like a field. It's something which has infinite range. It extends forever. The fields around the sun extend forever, but they have different magnitudes at different points. If you're closer, it'd be stronger. If you're further away, it'd be weaker. But gravity, electromagnetism, they all have infinite range because they don't experience time, basically. Because think about it, if we go back to the picture of relativity and this whole question about what's the speed of light, regardless of what it is, we know that light doesn't experience time because light is the thing which creates time in a sense, because that is the kind of basis, if you're traveling at the speed of light, the whole concept that Einstein's trying to kind of cement is that from the perspective of light, everything happens all at once. It's only when you slow down that you experience things in linear order. And that becomes even more relevant when you realize there's not just one axis of time, there's two. And that's itself required by current scientific theory. That's not even with all this stuff that I'm talking about. That's just the formalism requires two axes of time for antimatter. And when you think about that, it's like, well, light is something, and gravity, and these fields, because that's the best way to think about them, is like a field. These fields, which are oscillating, and when they oscillate, that's when they create particles. These fields, they're the only thing which are fundamental. And there's three of them. There's three massless ones. And in other words, to be massless means you don't experience time because you're not bending time. That's the key bit, is that light doesn't experience time because it doesn't bend time. it doesn't bend space-time. It doesn't bend the fabric. If you just imagine space-time like a fabric, reality like a fabric, like a sheet that's being oscillated, light, it doesn't do that unless it wants to, almost. Because, and this is the thing, is light conscious kind of thing? Because it's like, think about electricity, like, it's like almost saying that like electricity itself, like energy itself is God, you know, it's this kind of concept, this panpsychist worldview, but this has some kind of basis in physics because there are these massless particles, fields is a better word, which exist everywhere and, you know, are required for anything to exist. If there wasn't a magnetic field around me right now because my heart's pumping, none of the cells in my body would be able to exist. If the Earth's magnetic field wasn't around me right now, nothing could exist. Same with the sun, same with everything. And well, I discussed a little bit more about, we're going to have to skip over memory, but we'll get to that. Yes, please, Diego, thank you. Okay, so to kind of nail my colours to the mast, so to speak, a psychedelic Christianity. This is something which, again, I'm so grateful for Ben for touching on in his talk, because, you know, there is this kind of concept as well within the psychedelic community where there's been this reinterpretation of, is the tree of knowledge of good and evil a metaphor for a psychedelic experience and an ego death? And we all also have people like Allegro, who was one of the people who worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll talk about those in a minute. Who go as far as to say, no, Jesus was a mushroom. The whole thing is just a kind of, you know, it's just the metaphor, you know, straight in, you know, no holds barred. But I mean, personally, that's a step too far for me because I think there's plenty of evidence for the historicity of a man called Jesus. But I nevertheless do accede that there is definitely a concealment of a lot of original practices practiced by the early church, by later institutions which developed, and the patriarchy coming in, I think, is a big part of that. I'll discuss that a little bit more later. But the Roman Catholic Church, even the concept, I mean, this is quite significant for me because it's one which is quite subtle, but switching us onto solar time rather than lunar time as well is something which is very significant unconsciously in the way that your body is and the patterns that your body is engaged with. The moon is something which is much more aligned to humanity, arguably, especially women. And there's been an association, again, with these kind of ancient societies who use lunar calendars, and there's been a switch to solar, and there's been these kind of concepts like heathens introduced in this kind of association of mushrooms with witchcraft as well, which is, again, the Catholic Church and institutions like them. But it's important to remember that the Roman Catholic Church was not the first church, and it was not the one that was closest to where the action happened. The church in Jerusalem, I am personally much more fascinated by. It was led by James, who is allegedly, if you believe it, meant to be the brother of Jesus, so someone who was extremely close to him. And also, it would have most likely had a canon composed in Hebrew, which is obviously the contemporary language to Christ and Judaism, which, again, I would say Christianity's been disconnected from in the modern world as its Jewish roots. And, you know, we can all look at the kind of history of the Catholic Church and anti-Semitism to have a quick view of that. But it's not just the Catholics, to be fair, the Protestants as well. I mean, being an offshoot of Catholicism, Martin Luther as well was pretty notorious anti-Semite, and even removed a book written by James from the Protestant canon. So this is a whole other question as well, is like, which books are in the Bible? It's all well and good saying, there's a Bible, but which books are in the Bible? Because it's a big document, like it's it's actually a collection of documents written over thousands of years. So it's like, well, who's deciding which documents are in it and not? And like, obviously for the Roman Catholic Church, it was, there's these councils where all these men come from all around the empire in positions, and they decide which books are legit and not. But we know that actually all we have now to read yourself, if you go to the shop and buy a Bible, it will be based on the Greek version of the New Testament rather than the Hebrew, even though we know the Hebrew existed and we know it was significantly different in at least one significant way, which I'll touch on in a moment. But I'll just also say that these are kind of names for like proto-Christians, because they only became known as Christians quite later. But it's much more kind of, people would even say, oh, they were commie, the early church. That's the kind of meme. I wouldn't say it's that far, but I'd say it's at least more anarchistic, less kind of hierarchical, and wasn't as quick. It wasn't a collection of people that were intent on merging with the state, shall we say. Next slide, please. So the Dead Sea Scrolls. This, again, it's all happened in the 20th century. I mean, for real, I do think it's all happened in the 20th century. Like, you've got quantum mechanics, you've got psychedelics, and you've got the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, so these were found in 1946, and before that, the oldest copy of the Bible we had was not that old comparatively, maybe 1,500 years, something like that. But this dates back to the time of Christ himself, and predates that as well, because it was written by a community of Jews that lived in the desert, and that's how they've been preserved for so long, is because they're in some caves in the Judean desert. These have, interestingly, even today, they've not all still been released. There's been a monopoly over them by the institutions that operate in those regions. And I mean, even today, they're still only slowly being drip-fed. But it's really important to analyze it because it gives us that context to what we now have as the Bible. And it also shows us that actually the canon was in flux, even at that time, 2,000 years ago, because there's what's really key, really. I mean, a lot of it is similar. A lot of it's, a lot of Christians will say, oh, this is evidence that the Bible hasn't changed and you can trust it, because for people who are Muslim, for example, they would say, oh, the reason why the Quran has to exist is because the Torah has been corrupted, because the Jewish holy book hasn't been kept. But people say, oh, well, you can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and it's actually really similar. And it's like, well, that's true, but what about all this extra stuff that I'm seeing in the Dead Sea Scrolls that isn't in my Bible now? And there's all this crazy stuff as well, like, stuff about the angels and, all this mystical stuff, and about the Kabbalistic kind of orders of being, and this kind of much more like, please, yes.
Does that include the Gospel of Thomas?
So that's from the Nag Hammadi set of texts, which were discovered in Egypt. And that is interesting because Egypt was the place where, because a lot of the early church, they were in Jerusalem until the Second Jewish-Roman War, which was about, I'm going to get this wrong now, but it was about 70 AD, I want to say, something like that. So basically there's a period of time for about 30 years-ish where the church is flourishing in Jerusalem before the Romans come in and invade, and then it's scattered. And one of the places where they went was to Egypt, because Egypt's just next to there. And also it's further away from the mass of the Romans. So it's interesting, the Gospel of Thomas and stuff like that itself, but that's a kind of later, that would have been literature that was composed by Christians, etc., who would have fled. Whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls are also from just before. So interestingly, it focuses on this concept of the teacher of righteousness. And in this sense, it's very messianic, this community that lived in the desert 2,000 years ago, in the sense that they believed that there was a Messiah that was about to come, and he would, do these various things and lead a revolt against the Romans or whatever. And so in that sense, they're kind of still waiting for the Messiah. And there's this kind of question around whether this community believed Jesus was the Messiah and then went on to become Christians, or where did they go, kind of thing. Like, where are the descendants of the Essenes, the people who wrote these Dead Sea Scrolls? And one candidate I would offer is a people known as the Mandaeans. They're a small ethnic religious group that mostly live in Iraq. They're also known as Sabians in the Quran, and they have very similar beliefs. They are the earliest Gnostic religion as well, which is fascinating because most people say the kind of orthodoxy historically is that Christianity is fundamentally opposed to Gnosticism. Gnosticism being this idea that kind of God is immanent, that you don't need the mediator between you and God because God is everywhere and everything and everyone, kind of thing, right? It's like just right. But power doesn't. It's understandable that power and institutions that can benefit from disconnecting you from that inner power would work to kind of conceal these kind of Gnostic roots of Judaism and Christianity. And even Kabbalah itself, most people, the established orthodoxy is that Kabbalah is something which was only made by Jews in the Middle Ages. Whereas I imagine if you ask most people actually involved, they'd probably say it's an order much, much older. And also from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we also know that these kind of practices were much older and are much older. And there's all this kind of mystical incantations and magic, basically, like Jewish magic, which you wouldn't think is, the kind of orthodoxy now is like, oh, you're not allowed to meddle with that kind of thing.
The Sufis, didn't they?
Yeah, Sufis.
The Jewish mystics hung out with the Sufis, and that's why they learned their techniques of ecstasy.
I think it's the other way around.
Is it?
Mm.
Do the Mandaeans believe in the demiurge?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The Mandaeans themselves are interesting because they believe, it's hard to pin down what they believe because it's what's actually been translated into English because they're very, very secretive. And you can't join, you can't become a Mandaean, you have to be born or marry into it. Similar to Judaism, which is why it's theorized they come from it. But yes, to put it simply, they have a demiurge-like figure, and that is one key element of Gnostic cosmology, is that there's this idea that the God that we are pro-offered by the document that calls itself the Bible is itself a kind of trickstery figure that himself is actually part of the deception, and actually the real God isn't like the kind of hypermasculine God that is the kind of association that we have now with Christian kind of and Jewish concepts. Actually, in a Gnostic sense, you have this idea that it's borrowed from Hermeticism, Hermeticism being something from ancient Egypt, and aligning with alchemy, so that Gnosticism and alchemy are so heavily interrelated. In that they think that everything is a combination of masculine and feminine energies. So it doesn't make sense to talk about God as just being masculine in the way in which he's normally talked about. I'm doing it right now. And it's so interesting because it's so ingrained into pop consciousness. When, even the title Lord, right? Lord is the way in which the name of God is translated in most Bibles. And that's not the name of God that's written in the actual original Holy Scriptures, in the actual Dead Sea Scrolls. That's not what's written. It's not Lord, right? Even that association itself is kind of bringing in this kind of class system conceptualization as well with religion, rather than that there is still the association with Father, but I would argue personally that the biggest thing which is missing is the association of God as Mother. Next slide, please. Yes, James.
Sorry to press you, but we're getting pressed.
Yeah, I will. Sorry. Here we go. The Mother. So basically, I think this is the kind of what's missing for modern Christianity. And the ritual of baptism is most essential to that for me, because that's something which is both Jewish and Christian. It's something carried over, and also it's something which is meant to symbolize rebirth. And yet somehow the entity who's in charge of that is meant to be a man. Okay, isn't it women that give birth? But it seems like the female part of God has been concealed. And even in the Old Testament, if you look at the actual Hebrew words themselves, the ancient Hebrew word for spirit is feminine, and the presence of God is explicitly mentioned as feminine in the Old Testament. But again, it's not translated like that. Instead, the Roman Catholic Church have venerated Mary, a human, rather than the divine feminine itself. Next slide, please. Let's hurry it along. Well, this is a whole other curveball for you. So, I mean, yeah, that's a cool picture anyway. I like that. So maybe we'll just,
Is that the Mandelbrot?
Yes, it is indeed. It's the Mandelbrot set. So to get that, to just really boil it down for you, as well, there's this kind of, so I talked a lot about antimatter earlier as well, and I said there was two axes of time. I personally think that those axes of time aren't parallel, they're perpendicular. So what that means is that one's real and one's imaginary, which means, well, that's how you get a fractal. In order to generate a fractal, you have to use real and imaginary numbers. If you don't know what imaginary numbers are what happens when you take the square root of a negative number. Because you can do a square root of positive, square root of 4 is 2. But what's the square root of minus 4? It can't be 2, because 2 squared is 2. 4, I can't even do maths now. 4, and yeah, but it doesn't work. So there is this class of numbers that exists, but it's not intuitive. But humans, uniquely humans, have this kind of awareness of it. And we can use it. And actually, for quantum mechanics, you have to use these imaginary numbers in order to get valid solutions for the experiments, for the maths to align with the probabilities that you actually achieve. You have to assume these imaginary numbers play a causal role in reality. I would say it's because they correspond to the paths taken by antimatter, because if you imagine antimatter is traveling in imaginary time, not real time, then what that means is that explains how it can be everywhere all at once and it looks like it's traveling back in time, is because it's traveling in the time between time, it's traveling in subtime, or whatever you want to call it, in that kind of hyperdimensional sphere, which you can only really see when you look at a fractal and you see that it goes on forever. And the only way that works is because you're seeing the interplay between the real and imaginary. And between that's where you get infinity. And that's where you get the transcendental numbers like the exponential. I should have put it up here because it's one of my favorite equations. Euler's equation illustrates this best with where it shows that it's just a really simple formula. E to the power of xi plus 1 is 0. And that just illustrates how fundamental to mathematics itself is this division between the real numbers and the imaginary numbers. But we say they're imaginary, but they're real in the sense that they play a role. And I would say personally that if we could look at space, this is what it would look like. If we could look at it without in all of the spectrums of light, this is what it would look like. And this would also explain observations by the James Webb Space Telescope, which modern science can't answer, which shows that early galaxies which are meant to have formed billions of years ago, have the exact same spiral structure as modern galaxies, even when the current Big Bang cosmology wouldn't predict that. It predicts a slow, gradual evolution, just like from single-celled organism all the way to us. But instead, observations have shown that actually this spiral pattern is repeated everywhere you look in the universe, even in the wavelengths that are really old. And this really just is more evidence that we need to fundamentally rethink the way we see nature. And next slide, please, Diego. Almost there now, almost there. Appreciate it, guys. Okay, this is the final slide. And maybe I'll just leave that up, you know? I mean, yeah, I mean, it says it all, really, doesn't it? There's Mr. Musk, and it's just prompting you to think about, like, what's the end point of all, what is the goal? Like, if there is, because if, you know, time travel if the multiverse is something which exists, I didn't really go into this. Oh, I can't really go into it now. This is too long. But okay. Anyway, if this spiritual reality exists, where is this all going? Where is technological society going? And what are the consequences of us forgetting about this spiritual reality? You know, I've talked about one way in the patriarchy that's come in spiritually, but what are the other consequences in the way that we consume and interact with material reality? And also what will happen in the future? Where's the end point of it all? And the Bible has a very clear, the Bible, but generally, even in the books which are now not in the canon, they all have a very kind of apocalyptic vision of the end of reality. And so do lots of religions. They have this idea of Ragnarok or whatever. It's this very kind of, it's not a utopia. And that seems to be what modern society almost offers. It's like through technology, we can reach utopia. But it's like, will it be utopia? Or is there someone pulling the strings and will it be a dystopia? It's up to you to decide. That's it, I think. Well, there's one more slide, but it's just a thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, any questions, please?
Axes of time are perpendicular. What's like the 0 point?
So I actually think about it perpendicularly is, again, only a metaphor in the same way as the wormhole's a metaphor, because I personally think reality has 12 dimensions, but you can't really think about that. But I'd say the singularity is like the event horizon, so a black hole. And I personally would say that stars are white holes and sparks are white holes. And if you think about it in that way, then it's almost like matter that gets sucked into a black hole. That's how I think antimatter is produced, because it's sucked through onto the, if you just imagine a black hole as like a hole in the fabric of space-time, it's on the other side then, kind of thing. And so that would explain how there's more antimatter in the universe as well, because that's also another puzzle of modern science is, well, why isn't the ratio of matter to antimatter 1? Because if it was, there'd be nothing. But there isn't. It's like not 1, it's like 0 point whatever, and we can't even measure it, but it's not 1. So it's like, well, how is antimatter increasing? Well, I personally think it's getting sucked into black holes, and it's on the other side, and that's expanding the universe out.
Do you think the Big Bang might be like all the dark matter suddenly goes through a white hole and then bang, creates it?
Yeah, well, I guess I see a Big Bang as more of an ongoing process than like a single Big Bang. Like I think that I believe in the multiverse, so I believe that there's like every point in time, I think, is a galaxy. In the sense that that's how I think you can time travel, because again, I think that the government has time traveling devices, so I'm just going to throw that out there. Waiting for someone to come back and shoot me now. If you, it's like, how would you travel backwards in time? You know, in Doctor Who, it's like, you click on the computer and it just magically sends you there. But it's like, well, if you see every galaxy as like its own like single point in time, then the way you kind of switch timelines is you just travel to a different galaxy using a warp drive. Spoiler. To make you have negative mass, basically. Because if you have negative mass, then you can just do anything instantly. You can behave like antimatter, so to speak. And to get negative mass is actually quite easy, in the sense that it just requires a manipulation of these fields. You just have to basically oscillate an electromagnetic field at the same frequency as whatever material craft is made of. And the theory is, at least in the papers that have been published by the US Navy, that's how it works. You just, it's all about frequencies, right? And that's kind of another hippie thing. So it's frequencies, man. But like, you know, it's like, and once you start thinking about memory in a multiverse, it's even more fucked up, really. Like, because it's like, well, why am I only remembering like part of all the possible realities of me and versions of me that exist? What about all the other ones that I can sometimes dream about and imagine and think about, but they didn't happen? But like I can kind of, but it didn't happen. It's like, Yeah, I mean, that's fucked up in itself. I can discuss a little bit more about that, but I'll go on forever, so I'll try not to.
I wanted
Ben,
to
yes,
kind of
please.
Sorry, John, just gonna, because it kind of ties into the picture in a way, like, going back to the spiritual ideals of what fits in, rather than like the technicalities of all this, whatever. But like, I noticed you didn't really address consciousness, that in the sense of, because sometimes I thought of consciousness as like perhaps a particle or a wave within itself, which is kind of like what you're saying about light and God and all this kind of thing. And just, I suppose it ties into all of these things about light and everything being relative to whatever it's referenced to, and because perception is, for us as humans individually, it is our governing way of understanding the physical world around us, and therefore all of these conceptual things that you're talking about, whether it's impossible to understand for me, physics, or like spiritual stuff or whatever. So I was just wondering, where does consciousness fit into that? Where does perception fit into this? And if perception is so fundamental to our spiritual selves, where then? Because it totally is. Like, where does it sit within this scale of, say, like the physical, whether how it works, dark matter, whatever's going on, and say the Godhead? What do you want to experience that as? Like, where does our consciousness fit into that?
That's a great question. So from this image, I mean, I take this as kind of a representation of this kind of Trinity concept. We have Father, Mother, Son or Daughter. But then you've got the eyes, which are kind of everywhere, and that's something which is, again, in what people often call a UFO encounter, the UFO encounter in the Bible, in Ezekiel's vision, where they're all covered in eyes. The throne of God, the angels carrying the throne of God, they're all covered in eyes. And so I do think consciousness is fundamental in the sense that everything has consciousness, in the sense that incarnating itself in human form is not the only thing that consciousness does. God does, so to speak. Like, he also, and she also, they also incarnate in as insects, as fucking stuff you'll never understand, as all the infinite things that could possibly exist in the multiverse. I think that all that, everything, every possible form consciousness could take, it does. And consciousness is just the energy, the massless energy, the energy which just exists and itself creates time and space. That is consciousness. And consciousness just creates different points in space-time, different galaxies, to just experience different things. And that's it. But for humans, there's this clear kind of way in which consciousness, God, tries to relate to us, and there's a certain nature that our psyche has, and we have a certain division that's necessary for reproduction and create new, different forms of consciousness.
So are we special then, do you think?
Well, personally, I think yes, because I think that only humans have the possibility for their ego, for their version of consciousness, to live forever and not just die now. And I personally would say that that's only possible if you don't plug in. If you plug into the internet, if you get that chip in your brain, I'm sorry, it's gone. Because what makes you you has gone. Because if you can access every experience through the internet, just like that, at the speed of light, then whatever makes you you has gone. Only what makes you you, me different from you, is that we have limitation. If you see us as both God incarnating themselves, then the only thing that separates me and you is the limitations that we have and the things, different experiences we've had. If we have exactly the same experience, Ben and Josh as concepts cease to exist. So I think that the purpose of all this is to produce these kind of personalities that then it's almost like consciousness is lonely, but it's not lonely because it doesn't want anything, but it's almost like that. It's just like infinite creativity. And I don't think that it would want to... I also don't believe in an eternal hell, because why would consciousness want to torture itself forever? Like, it just doesn't even make sense. And people say that all the time. Like, well, why would God create me and then torture me forever? It's like, yeah, fucking fair play. Like, if consciousness creates... Well, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean... But yeah, I mean, I think there is something unique, and that if we lose sight of that, which we are as we're just digitizing everything, then I think we're going down a dark path, basically.
Or if you would like to do it.
Well, if you want to do it, then you'll experience everything all at once, I think. I think you'll literally... I mean, fair play. I think it's just, do you want to live forever? And that's a question everyone has to ask themselves. It's like, do you want to live forever?
Yeah.
And how do you want to live forever? Like, because time's relative, right? So it's like, well, if you just download yourself, or you upload yourself and you just download every experience, it's like, well, that perception of time is going to be fucked. Like, so fucked. Like, imagine if you could just download, like, multiple things at once, and you're just, like, your brain will just get fried. But, like, I think that's what's coming. Like, well, yeah, because what makes you is in Diego and Josh is your brain, right? Because that provides the limitation, because you have a certain web of neurons which allow the electricity, if you take like electricity as like God.
Let the neuroscientists come in, because consciousness and the brain are not the same thing.
One sec. I think if people wanting to start clearing out, that's fine. We're going to keep the space open for questions for as long as necessary.
Like my brain with all of its destroyed neurons is not them.
Well, it's a different person. That's for sure. You're different second to second.
If I would take like one single neuron, like an exchange, like if you're changing like neurons, right? You would give me one neuron and I will give you one back. At what point you will become Diego, and at what point I will become Josh?
Great question.
This is the question.
That's a great philosophical question. Yeah, that really is.
Let's think about it like this. Like we're talking about spirituality and all the thing.
How much acid do you need to take to make it different?
Let's try it.
Yeah, I think between us we can manage it, mate. But we need to do an experiment.
Each other's eyes for 14 hours. Really trying to spot most
But yeah, no,
Sounds like a plan.
But consciousness has no definition, right? In psychology, neurology, in anything, it is yet to be defined.
Yeah, but we value the oneness. You know, we look to the oneness like this is a transcendental quality that we should all become. We should all be one. We should all be the same. And in a sense, there's a duality there. There's a hematic duality. It's now chemical duality, because you have the oneness, but against the oneness you have separateness. Surely a holistic state of being embraces the oneness and embraces the differences in the same time. You know, in the same way that we embrace the expansion of the universe, we embrace mass and matter, we also embrace antimatter. That's what hermetics were doing before we even have a test or we'd be able to measure this stuff.
But that's human consciousness, though. How do you apply that to a chip or a dog or a cat?
How would you apply it?
Particle?
When you say that the speed of light or light itself is consciousness, what is your definition of conscious you're using there?
Just awareness. Basically an energy excitation. Because if you just see like consciousness as the deep, well, to me they're not. That's kind of what I'm saying. It's like it's like you can't verify that like an atom is conscious, but you also can't verify that it's not. And it's like also like all the just crazy things that you experience that are sub your perception, but still part of your psyche. And that's where this concept of like animal spirits come in, and that actually we are kind of interrelated with these animals, but not just materially in the way that the Darwinian paradigm says, but also spiritually in the sense that we're animated by the same antimatter that animates them. And I'd say that antimatter is really the source of consciousness, because it's something which is just everywhere all at once, because it's in imaginary time. Like, what the fuck? Like, yes, please. Yes.
In physics, energy is quantized.
Unless it's a field.
But in a field, what we can refer to are quantized excitations in the field.
That's ones when you measure it.
The field exists.
Yes.
Because of forces acting on particles within the field.
Sorry, what does quantized mean?
It means it can be described in numbers.
Discrete chunks.
Chunks that instead of being
Infinite.
Well,
Continuous.
instead of being continuous,
which is like something which we can't actually describe in mathematics. So, I mean, you can, but it's
It won't give you solutions. Yeah.
If consciousness is an energy field, firstly, what is the forces imparting matter? And secondly, the contents of what we have access to as conscious experience domains is qualitative experiences. So the color blue, you can't describe it to somebody else. If somebody lived all of their life with color blindness, no matter how much they learned about I don't know, wavelengths of light or how the brain processes color perception or something, they wouldn't be able to experience the color blue, right? So that's qualitative. How can that be simultaneously a quantitative energy field?
That is a great question. That really is.
Come on, Josh. You know the answers.
I don't know. I'd say. So if you're saying if we assume that consciousness has a qualitative aspect to it, nature, sure, let's use that word. I think that is that oneness that Liam is referring to, and that's what light experiences. Light experiences everything, and because imagine it like this, imagine every single photon is actually connected, and every experience that every photon has is experienceable imagine there's only one photon, because that's kind of what it really is there is actually not multiple photons. Because we think about it like, your brain lights up and then there's some photons that are produced by your body by this chemical reaction. But if you think that actually that's just a kind of time distortion caused by the fact that we are traveling slower than light, then that's when quantity comes into it. It's only when you're traveling slower than light speed that things become discrete. At light speed, at the rate at which these fields themselves oscillate. It's like the qualitative creates the quantitative, to put it kind of bluntly. I think that the qualitative experience is everywhere, but all that you can get quantity from that, because that is consciousness limiting itself, deliberately slowing itself down and taking different forms.
Also the quantity.
Well, not from its own perspective, only from ours. That's the thing, it's like, not from its, because there's no sense of scale from the perspective of light, because everything happens instantly. Because it's like, from light's perspective, i.e. God's perspective, it's, in my view, it's 2000 BC and it's today. And it's 2000 years in the future, it all collapses. So, I don't know if that's answered the question, but I mean...
I'm still not sure how, in your system, duality emerges from non-duality.
Right, yeah, that's kind of what we're digging down into, yeah. Purposefully, I think. I think it's because I believe that duality has a purpose, and this is what I mean by I think that humans have something special about them, is there is that duality which exists in order to allow the development of what we'd refer to as souls and memories. Having your identity as John requires you having a quantized memory. If your memory was unquantized and just consciousness qualitatively, you wouldn't have any identity as John. But in order for consciousness to incarnate in different forms and experience the vastness of creativity available to it, it has to quantize itself. Because that's how we exist.
Come from an experience.
It's like, but to have the... Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. We can discuss this.
Sure, man. Yeah, I'm loving it. Yes.
To try and pick apart your idea.
Please do. Please. There's plenty to pick at. So, Fergus.
I was going to quickly ask about one of your earlier slides. You said that spirit is the opposite of matter. I didn't quite get where you got that inference from. The logic.
Well, in the sense, literally, I think it's antimatter, but also as a conceptual kind of tool as well. Is this like there's this concept that like focusing on the spiritual realm is different to the material realm. Like if you're focused on the material realm, you'll value different things in life than if you focus on the spiritual realm. And if you focus, because the spirit is focusing on that which connects us, and it's focusing on. I would also say it's focused more on a kind of social. It's more socially orientated, whereas matter is much more individualistic, and you need both because you need the collectivism and you need the individuality. But again, I'd see that as the interplay between the masculine and the feminine, and I'd see there as being an excess of masculinity in our society because we've lost touch with a lot of our spirituality, which is also a more pro-social behaviour, which generally I'd say men tend to be more psychopathic, personally. Spoken as a man.
There's building on that, there's also the idea of quintessence, which comes from alchemy, and that quintessence is quint, 5 essence, essential, so it's the 5th element, which is referred to as ether.
Yeah.
That correlates with prana, with chi, with various traditions across the world, where they see spirit as breath. So it's distinct from air, it's distinct from water, earth and fire, it's its own element onto itself. So anytime someone uses the word quintessence, you know that refers to ether, which is the essential qualities of something outside a world of difference.
Love it, that's it. Great answer. I don't even need to be stood up anymore. Yeah, that's it. Incredible. Thank you.
Just before everyone goes, we have got the party, the end of the party on the 1st of June. We've got a psychedelic rock band playing, Will and Moen's playing, Cameras playing.